Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. Well, after 2 days of sun and reasonable weather, we've returned to the rain again, and it hasn't been heavy rain, but if you have a look at the wet on my driveway, it's clearly the soil was still quite saturated, and it didn't take much to bring it back to a sort of a muddy state. No doubt the macadamia trees are still liking it, and this sort of level of rain is usually very beneficial for the soil because it doesn't run in any great amount. But gosh, you know, there's nothing pretend or real macadamia farmers can do really. You can't harvest, you can't really fertilise, you can't do anything much for pre-harvest preparation because you just tear up the soil and you go for a slide on your equipment. And you definitely can't spray, although you'd only be spraying this time of year if there was a major problem. So what can you do? Well, you can plant new trees. And I've been casting around for a few offcuts or odd lots of trees to put in block one, and simply because it's the right time of year to plant. Autumn is definitely the best time of year. And however, when you do put in orders for trees, you normally have to put them in a year in advance. And so that can be a bit of an issue when you just come up out of the blue and say to people, hey, got any trees? But there was a couple of expressions of interest, but one that I grabbed hold of was a contact from Tim Hills of Hills Horticultural Services in Dunoon. Went out and saw him today. Great little nursery, really competently run with all the right precautions and everything in place. He does macadamias and a couple of other things. But he had for me some of these. What are these trees? These are 11 trees of variety R. R is one of the four new varieties brought out by Hort Innovation, or effectively linked to CSIRO, after the research that dates back to the 1990s on crossing various trees. R is an interesting combination of Dadao and 842, two fairly dense, smaller sort of trees that crop reasonably well. 842 in particular seems to do well in just about all districts. R was selected for the Northern Rivers in particular, not recommended for Bundaberg, but in the Northern Rivers it performed very, very well in the trial site at Alstonville. And because it's not an overly large tree, it hopefully doesn't have very many long-term maintenance issues. Unlike the other new varieties, it has a medium thickness husk and a medium thickness shell, so its kernel recovery is a bit lower than the other ones at about 37% odd. On the other hand, the thicker shell and the thicker husk can in some cases reduce insect damage and make the plant a little bit more resistant to some of the common things that attack it. According to Tim, the R's are quite vigorous growers, as are the G's, which is another one of the new varieties. And so they're sort of jumping out of these pots. They're certainly, they're about, I'd say, allowing for the pot height, they're probably about 3 feet tall, and they all look very healthy. So that's variety R, and it will be my first planting of one of these 4 new recommended varieties. But, as they say in the ads, that's not all. He also let me have these enormous fellows in great big garden pots that you might find at a nursery. These are 2 trees, one of which is above my head. So if you take away the pot height, it would be just under 6 feet tall. Has absolutely massive, thick, leathery leaves. This is, ladies and gentlemen, variety J. And variety J is one of the varieties that of the 4 new ones that was introduced that actually has it's an interesting heritage. It has A16 as one of its parents, and if you look at the leaves, you can believe that. There's some rolled edges on the leaf, and the leaf sort of does look like an A16 leaf, although really, in some cases, it's a bit bigger. Its other parent is a little-known variety called 781. 781 was one of those a progeny of 246 that didn't get wide acceptance in Australia. There was no particular reason for it other than it dropped its nuts quite late. But otherwise it was a spreading tree. It was a bit like 246, had quite large nuts and just didn't take off. The 783 you would put in the same category, but apparently the 783 is also one of those good trees that was overlooked. Anyway, the cross between the two of them apparently produces massive nuts with massive kernel recovery in the order of 45%, which, probably the large size nut reflects the A16 heritage, but the 781's nuts were also quite large. So that's sort of fair enough. It's a mid to late season dropper. It doesn't have, its real drawback in terms of the nut is it doesn't have a high percentage of whole kernels. In fact, it's quite a low percentage of whole kernels. Having said that, the way we are currently paid by nut processors is we're paid for high kernel recovery, but we aren't paid for whole nuts. And, it produces apparently a fair bit of kernel, and it does so within about 3 years of planting. Unlike variety R over there, J seems to do well in both the Bundaberg and the sort of Northern Rivers districts. So I'm keen to try that, and given how old this tree is, it might only be a couple of years before I have to wait before we start getting nuts on it. So these varieties, the G, J, R and P, are starting to be nicknamed the Fab Four by the industry. And according to Tim Hills and according to others I've spoken to, there's now a lot more ordering of these varieties after a slow start. The favourite is variety G, which I don't have yet, but I'm looking for samples of. I'm absolutely determined to put a few variety G on my farm and maybe even use it in my replant scenario. And the fourth one, variety P, apparently Tim has a few that he might slip my way, and while P is only recommended for the Bundaberg region, there have been plantings of it in New South Wales because it's a very small tree that you can plant quite densely, and while it has a dense canopy, it actually apparently crops quite heavily. So there are people in New South Wales trying that. So who knows? I may get all of the Fab Four in my orchard at some stage, but for the moment, variety J and variety R are making an entrance, and they are going to go into block 1, which already has a large number of varieties that I both know and don't know. So that's really going to be quite the experiment block, and close to the house where I can keep an eye on them and guide my future plantings. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope you're staying out of the wet. Tomorrow I certainly won't be because I'll be planting these fellas, but I will hopefully see you again soon, and you will see these trees again in other videos. Big thank you to Tim Hills from Hills Horticultural Services for making these trees available. Catch you soon. Bye.